Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. My name is Nick Soberall. I've also got Megan Brass on the line, and a member of our Science Collaborative staff. We're glad you can join us for today's webinar titled Restoring Native Oysters on North America's West Coast. The webinar today is part of a monthly webinar series that features research, integrated assessment, and science transfer projects funded by the Science Collaborative. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System, or NERRS, is a network of 29 unique research reserves as shown on this map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve site includes programs focused on land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The Science Collaborative was one of the research funding mechanisms for the reserve system. In addition to providing grants, we also work to promote the research and engagement happening across the reserve system through webinars like today. All attendees are muted upon entry and will be handling questions via the question feature on the GoToWebinar console. We'll have time for questions at the end of the webinar, but we encourage you to submit your questions as they occur to you throughout the webinar by entering them into the questions field on the webinar console. Just a quick note about bandwidth, as we are kind of in some uncharted territory with the webinar series. So right now we've got Kirsten and April who are nice enough to share their webcams for us for the introduction stage. I believe they said they will go ahead and turn those off to conserve some bandwidth when we start the actual presentation, but they'll pop back on for the Q&A at the end. So just a note there. If you do have any other questions, you can always type them into the questions console, and any of the Science Collaborative staff on the call will do our best to address them. So with that, I'll introduce our speakers today. Kirsten Wasson has served as research coordinator of the Elkhorn Slough Reserve for the past 20 years, publishing about 40 papers on a variety of topics in estuarine science during this period, from sea otters to water quality. Her passion is restoration science of native oysters and salt marshes. While she is dedicated to place-based research, she has also led various collaborative endeavors across a network of oyster and marsh restoration sites, scaling up to seek generality in estuarine ecology. April Ridlin is an applied marine ecologist interested in the effects of human impacts, including fishing and harvesting, recreational activities, and biological invasions. She is currently the collaborative lead for the Native Olympia Oyster Collaborative and a postdoctoral fellow with the Science for Nature and People Partnership. In these roles, she engages in and coordinates research into the native Olympia oyster and is assessing aquaculture as a conservation intervention for this oyster and for marine foundation species broadly. Kirsten will start us off, so I'll go ahead and pass it to her now.
Thank you, Nick.
And just one moment while we pass presenters here. This is a little bit different than what we usually do, so passing it over to Kirsten.
All right, and there I am, and turn my video off. Slideshow. There we go. All right, so thank you so much for inviting us to give this webinar, and you'll get another chance to see our beautiful logos later on, so I'll just launch right in. April and I will be tag teaming through this talk. I'll start with an overview, then she will talk about our coastwide network. I'll talk about restoration approaches, and she'll end up talking about lessons learned and next steps. So backing way up, just to frame the discussion, foundation species in any ecosystem are important, providing structured habitat that serves as home or refuges, provides ecosystem services in the habitat, the ecosystem they're in. Of course, estuaries are mostly squishy places dominated by unconsolidated sediment. And in these, foundation species are particularly important to provide some structure, such as that provided by salt marshes and by eelgrass. Oysters are the iconic foundation species of estuaries. And at this point, I was going to toss it back to Nick briefly to give you a little poll just to get a sense of our rather large audience on this call. I'd like you to answer in the poll when he puts it up. Have you ever seen a live oyster? Have you ever eaten an oyster? And then have you ever seen a live Olympia oyster? And have you ever eaten an Olympia oyster? So Nick, I don't know how you switch to that, but go for it.
It's on the screen right now, so we're at, give it a couple more seconds and I'll close the first one.
Oh, excellent. So this is something I can't see because my screen is taking up the whole screen, so you can tell me at the end what the outcomes are.
Are you able to see the poll results now?
I cannot, so you can just...
Sure, I'll just read them off to you. So 93% responded yes to having seen a live oyster in the wild, 7% said no. We'll go ahead and put the next one up. Polls responses are rolling in for the second one. Okay. This one, 52% responded no to having seen a live Olympia oyster. So a little over half. Okay, and the third question, have you ever eaten an oyster? That was some fast voting. Wow. All right. 90% said yes.
All right.
All right, and one more. Ever eaten an Olympia oyster? Pretty quick responses again. All right, 68% have not eaten an Olympia oyster. 32% have.
All right.
All right, so I'll go ahead and hide these.
Thank you. And then everyone can see my screen again, is that correct?
Yep, I can see your screen again.
Perfect.
So you are
perfect.
Up.
Well, thank you for participating so rapidly in that, and it helps give me and April a sense of who you are. Even though your answers for the Olympia oyster questions were much lower than for the any oyster questions, it actually appears to me like we have a pretty strong representation of Olympia oyster fans on this call, because your numbers were actually relatively high for those Olympia oyster questions. If you had a more random sample, the very few people really have seen or eaten Olympia oysters. All right, that was fun. So for those of you who don't know the Olympia oyster well, it's our only native oyster from Baja California to British Columbia. And human beings have been interacting with this species for 10,000 years on our coast. It's really a part of our legacy of healthy coastal ecosystems. And for the 68% of you, or whatever it was, who have never eaten an Olympia oyster, they are tasty. Thank you, Gary, for my first-hand knowledge on that. And they formed the basis of the first commercial aquaculture on the West Coast. Our oysters typically form pretty small clusters. Like any oysters, they form biogenic habitat growing on each other, but their clusters are on the petite side compared to some other species. And so they're definitely foundation species, but they form more low relief beds than some of you may be familiar with from Chesapeake Bay look of oysters. Olympia oysters can be highly abundant when conditions are right, such as in this mecca for Olympia oysters on the west coast of Vancouver Island on a gravel bar. But overall, oysters globally have declined and in abundance, and that's true on the west coast as well, for sure, such as here, where they're estimated to be at less than 1% of their historic biomass in estuaries on this coast. And sometimes the decrease in abundance is all the way to zero, that we've actually lost oysters in some estuaries where they were historically present. such as here in California, places like Morro Bay, Bolinas Lagoon, or Big Lagoon. And the estuary where I work, Elkhorn Slough and the Monterey Bay, which I'll refer to disproportionately much since I know it best, it has a green star still, but it really is at risk at becoming one of those red stars for local extinction. In 2010 paper, I estimated our population in the estuary at 5,000, but by 2018, it was less than 1,000, I think. So what challenges oysters? Why don't they always look like this everywhere? One major stressor on this coast is goopy mud, is burial in sediment, because these small biogenic clusters are easily buried. And human influences have really affected that factor. So at Elkhorn Slough, we have erosion from agriculture, but in other areas, there's other sources of sedimentation into the estuary. And then nutrient loading and eutrophication can lead to a big increase in goop in your estuary from decaying algal mats and so on. So then instead of having oysters on natural shell bits like this, which is probably how they used to look at Elkhorn Slough 200 years ago, you find them only on large artificial hard substrates that are big enough to avoid burial in mud. Another factor that is challenging to oysters is water quality. They're pretty tolerant overall, but extensive hypoxia, for instance, can limit oysters, we have found. And again, there's anthropogenic drivers of that. In our estuaries on this coast, as on any coast, a huge proportion was diked and drained and is still behind water control structures today to facilitate human land uses, and that can really tank your oxygen levels at night. And likewise, eutrophication and nutrient loading can do the same. In some places, predators cause high mortality for oysters. In particular, non-native oyster drills that came in with aquaculture with Japanese or Asian and Atlantic coast oysters. The drills came along with them. And that's a major factor in some places. So I've been showing you adults and talking about adults, but another part of the challenges to oysters is reproduction. And just an aside here for those of you who don't know this species, in contrast to Crassostrea, which free spawns, Olympia oysters brood their larvae, and so their larval shell is formed while they're still inside the mother, which may offer them some protection from acidification, coincidentally. So making babies is another challenge, especially in populations that are already very small. Many of us monitor recruitment regularly simply by putting out clean tiles. You can buy them at Home Depot and put them out and see how many oysters are on there next time you check a year later or more often. And in a good year, your tiles get little baby oysters settled on them, which within a matter of a few months grow up to be big oysters in a warmish estuary like ours. But in most years that I put out tiles at Elkhorn Slough, they bear or they get non-native fouling species on them. So this is my oyster monitoring data, recruitment density per meter squared at the 4 sites with most abundant oysters in Elkhorn Slough. And you can see that we only had good recruitment in 2 of the years that I monitored. I'm getting a network connection difficulty message. You guys hopefully can hear me okay.
We can still hear you.
And okay, good. Getting a little pink box. We had such reproductive failure that since 2012, on the hundreds of tiles I've put out, I've seen 1 single oyster. And in earlier work with a variety of collaborators that we published in Ecology, we looked at what correlates with such estuary-wide recruitment failure and found places like Elkhorn Slough with low adult numbers and small networks of adult sites are particularly vulnerable. Like at Elkhorn Slough, you can draw a line between the 2 most distant oyster sites in the estuary, and it's only 7 kilometers long. And you can't draw a connecting line to the north or south to an estuary within larval dispersal distance because they're hundreds of kilometers away. So it's a very isolated little population. While in contrast, say in Southern California or in Puget Sound, there are more populations within your network. So wherever oysters are facing challenges and have undergone declines at Elkhorn, Slough, and elsewhere, efforts are underway to try to help them out and do restoration. And while our place-based conservation work is inherently local, we're each taking care of our own special places, one thing we've really learned over the past years is that networks allow you to scale up and learn from each other. And so at this point, I am going to make April the presenter and hand it over to her.
Thanks, Kirsten. Hopefully you can all see my screen. So here we are, ready to talk about the coastwide network that we spent the last year developing. So as Kirsten mentioned, in the past decade or so, there have been a number of restoration efforts for this species. And here you can see examples from Elkhorn Slough, Natarts Bay, and Puget Sound as examples. Often these projects were initiated with local objectives, and because of that, they had different goals and used different methods. And because of the way that our coast is designed, and estuaries can be really far flung from one another, and so that means that these sites could be hundreds of miles apart, which tends to limit collaboration or communication between the people who are engaged in these restoration efforts. But that's not to say that some collaboration hasn't already been put in place. In fact, early efforts were made to bring together this Olympia oyster restoration community by Kay McGraw and Natalie Constantino Manning from NOAA, Betsy Peabody from the Puget Sound Restoration Fund, and others, who organized 2 workshops around 2008-2009, specifically for the purpose of bringing this community of practice together. And the proceedings of those were published in a special issue of the journal Shellfish Research in 2009. Then in 2015, collaborators from many of the organizations that now form our current network's steering committee came together to produce this document that synthesized and summarized monitoring and experimental data to identify factors for sustainable Olympia oyster populations, including things like environmental conditions, site evaluations, and trends in oyster populations over this wide geographic spatial range. And this was sort of the first attempt of its kind to start to collate and analyze data from these different restoration efforts. Last year, our group received funding from the Neuroscience Collaborative to formalize this network of scientists, restoration practitioners, agencies, tribal communities, and growers across 2,500 kilometers of the West Coast. And we have formalized that network, which now calls itself the Native Olympia Oyster Collaborative. We currently have 35 steering committee members and over 140 members coast-wide, some of whom are on the call today. So hello, Nook collaborators. The vision of this group is resilient native oyster populations in a network of bays and estuaries from British Columbia to Baja California, valued by people and forming an integral part of healthy coastal ecosystems. And we intend to carry out that vision through 4 major overarching goals that we've identified. The first is community engagement. So we really aim to raise the public profile of this species, which so many people are not aware of, and to build support for Olympia oyster conservation and restoration coastwide. Then, of course, restoration and conservation is our second sort of pillar. We'd like to learn from one another to improve the design and implementation of projects and increase collaboration between people who are already working on this species. Thirdly, we'd like to boost research to exchange information to improve our understandings of factors that are limiting oyster populations and potentially identify ways that we can design restoration projects specifically to address those. And then our fourth pillar is aquaculture, and I'll be talking a little bit more in depth about a new project we've just launched in this arena. But the basic idea is that we'd like to share approaches for using hatcheries to support the conservation of this species, especially in places that are recruitment limited. One of the main accomplishments of this group last year is the website that I'm about to give you a tour of. And on this website, you can find the resources that we worked together to create. The first one is an archive and interactive map of all of the current and historic restoration projects on the West Coast. And so we developed a shared restoration database, which you can get access to yourself if you're interested, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. But I'm also going to show you the map that was created from this, which is a much more user-friendly way of exploring those restoration projects. I'll show you where our resources for educators and students are, and information about this oyster for the general public. So this is our website, which you can hopefully see up on your screen. And I'll start from the top with public information. We wanted to provide some information about what oysters do, and specifically about this little oyster that is pretty different from other oysters, as Kerstin mentioned. And then also provide some information about Olympia oysters as food, which is one avenue through which the public can connect with this species. Then you'll see we have a teaching tab here where you can get access to lesson plans and other resources that can be used inside and outside of the classroom. And then under our restoration tab, if you go to the West Coast projects, what I really want to highlight here is the story map that we created from that restoration database that I mentioned. Now, if you are one of those people who like to look at an Excel spreadsheet, you can email us at our contact and get access to that restoration database. But this, as you can see here, is the cover page of our story map. And what you'll see is that through this interactive map, if you're interested in any particular restoration project, you can click on that restoration project, and along the side here, you can learn things like what the project goals were, what approaches they took, what years it was implemented, some of the major challenges they might have faced. And you can also see that you have access to who the project leads are and how to get in contact with those people. So this is not only valuable for the scientific community and the restoration community, but if you were looking to learn more about how restoration would be done in your neck of the woods, this is a great resource to network people together. And you can see this for all 39 sites that we collected data for. So with that, I think I'm going to hand this back over to Kerstin, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about the approaches, the different approaches that restoration practitioners took.
And while she's doing that, thank you to Monica Almeida, who made that story map, who I see is participating in the webinar today. She's the one who made that beautiful story map for us.
Yes, thank you, Monica. Such a great resource to have and share.
That cover photo had Steve Rumroll on it, carrying some oysters, and he's on here, so hello, Steve, too. All right, so I'm gonna now talk about some of what we learned from that database of all past and current Olympia oyster restoration projects that April had just mentioned to you. So from a survey of a bunch of you on this webinar today and everyone we could get in touch with the coast, along the coast, we obtained information on 39 different projects. And here's a bit of an overview of how those looked over time. So number of projects started in a different period, in the different periods. And you can see in most periods we had less than 10 new projects started, but there was sort of a golden period in the 2010s where a lot of different projects were started. And the color coding shows you the geographic patterns that California, shown in yellow, and Washington's shown in purple, account for the majority of Olympia oyster restoration projects. We found that relatively little financial investment has gone into Olympia oysters compared to, say, salt marsh restoration or other types of restoration. 32 of the 39 projects shared their budgets with us, and adding those all up only totaled about $8 million. So that's $8 million of investment across 2,500 kilometers of coast over 20 years. I think we can do more than that in the coming 20 years. And in terms of the cost per project, they were hugely variable. You can see just in terms of the standard deviation is similar to the mean for all of these, but in general, the projects were most expensive, highest investment in California, and lowest in Oregon, but relatively modest per project amounts. We found that larger is better, and thank you to Thea Marks and Danielle Zackrell who prepared this figure, and they're on this webinar. It's the log cost per area versus the project area, and you can see a nice decline there. And most of these large and cost-effective projects are these purple dots in Washington state, though some in all states. In terms of the restoration approach that was used, almost every project involved adding hard substrates to mudflats. In terms of what substrate was added, by far most common, it was Pacific oyster shell. We don't have enough Olympia oyster shell to add that, and so it's mostly aquaculture grown Pacific oyster. Loose shell and bagged shell together account for the majority of substrates added, though concrete was also fairly common. To get some visuals of what this looks like, and these are from that story map that April was showing you, here's a massive scale of addition of loose Pacific oyster shell that can then spread over extensive areas of mudflat. And here's what bagged Pacific oyster shell looks like, Netarts Bay. And those bags can be stacked to raise a higher profile, such as here. In just one project used clusters of Pacific oyster shells to mimic those sort of natural clusters that Olympia oysters form, and that's the same approach we use in Elkhorn Slough, but using native gaper clamshell rather than Pacific oyster. But some projects do use concrete. The concrete is often mixed with shell bits and often with local sediments too. So it's not entirely an external substrate. And one thing that emerged from our review was that the profile of the added substrate really varies by region. So low profile projects accounted for about 2/3 of projects, but they were all the projects in Washington and most in Oregon. Conversely, high profile projects accounted for about 1/3 of projects, and many in California, especially in San Francisco Bay, were high profile. So that's not something we'd really been tuned into until we did this synthesis, that there's a difference there. Beyond adding hard substrates, a bunch of the projects also added Olympia oysters where there weren't enough there to naturally recruit onto the substrates you put out. 7 projects moved adults, 8 moved wild collected spat, and 16 projects added hatchery raised juveniles. And really the pioneer there is in the Puget Sound area, the Puget Sound Restoration Fund, and most recently the NOAA partnering Kenneth Chu Shellfish Hatchery, growing a lot of those. This is something at Elkhorn Slough that we've just gotten into recently. We've found for those populations that recruit so poorly that raising them in the hatchery is a good alternative. So here they are settled on the clamshells that we use, and We put out the first new generation of Olympia oysters in Elkhorn Slough since 2012 using this technique, and that got April and me interested in conservation aquaculture as a topic, which we'll talk more about later on in the talk today. So before I pass it back to April, I'd like to end with a more sort of some philosophical reflections on Olympia oyster restoration that have grown out of this synthesis of the 39 projects, as well as my experience at Elkhorn Slough. And I feel like these are questions that you should ask before beginning oyster restoration, and you want to answer them with scientists and with stakeholders in your region. And there is no right answer. The answers are going to differ based on the region and the interests of the community. So one thing we can ask is, where do oysters most need our help? Some places have abundant and increasing populations. Other places have rare and decreasing populations. We really can make the biggest difference in moving the needle on helping Olympia oyster populations in places where the populations have declined the most. And so if that's something that's important to a funder or a broad regional organization, TNC or Pew or something, that's an important question to ask and to determine your site selection. Another question to ask is, at what scale do we want to make a difference? And again, this just varies by project. We found that in our synthesis, for some projects, the goals, the objectives of the project were at the site scale of adding a foundation species to a mudflat that didn't have any. And the difference was really at the scale of that single mudflat. But for other projects, such as in Fidalgo Bay, the goal was actually to significantly increase the Olympia oyster population size in that whole estuary or inlet. And so it's something you should think about before you start, of what are you trying, at what scale are you trying to make a difference? Another question is, how can we help the oysters the most? We want to help Olympia oysters. What action should we invest in? And I think one important starting place there is to think about the ecosystem processes first. If there are places where the water quality is poor due to, say, water control structures, you may actually grow the most oysters by focusing on restoring ecosystem health rather than single species measures. However, when you have a site where overall the ecosystem health is good, but hard substrates are limiting, there's fewer hard substrates now than there were historically, so that's probably not the case in a very urban area, but in some estuaries it is the case, then adding substrate may be the way you can most help oyster populations. Finally, if the population size is too small to allow for reproduction, sustainable reproduction, then adding oysters might be how you help them. And ideally that's not going on forever, but you get them up to a sustainable population size, and then they're self-sustaining. So you can also ask these questions sort of backwards and say, not where can we help oysters, but where can oysters most help us? So focusing on an ecosystem services framework. And one place where Olympia oyster restoration can really help people is where it can return cultural legacy, such as places where tribal communities for thousands of years interacted with oysters, and restoring a population can return that service to them. Another important service is water quality filtration. So in places where the water quality is very impaired and where there aren't many other filter feeders, conducting a filtration service, then increasing Olympia oyster numbers might significantly improve water quality. Another type of ecosystem services is providing habitat for fish. I didn't have a picture of a salmon on an Olympia oyster bed, but that's what I was thinking of as an example, where you may be improving fisheries catch by restoring oyster beds along particular routes used by salmon. So With this sort of framework, you can choose the places where oyster restoration will lead to the biggest increase, measurable increase in the desired services. One thing I want to point out is that you really need to ask yourself, your organization, if the focus is entirely on ecosystem services, should we care about which species achieves those services? We have our native Olympia oyster, and there are feral populations of Crestostrea gigas along this coast. They both taste good, they both filter water, they both provide fish habitat and protect shorelines, though presumably in somewhat different ways. Ecosystem services alone may not provide the rationale for why you should conserve native biodiversity. So that's just something to think about in how you frame your project. Assuming you proceed with substrate addition, that seems to be how you can help oysters the most, you need to ask what sort of approach you should use. If stakeholders want historic biogenic habitat structure or want to minimize non-native fouling cover, then it really makes sense to choose a low profile, such as adding loose shells. On the other hand, if your stakeholders want shoreline protection from wind waves and can tolerate a fair amount of non-native cover, or if you're committed to working in an area that is really muddy, then you probably want to go with a high profile approach and maybe use something like concrete. Another important framing question, I think, is how much oyster, eelgrass, mudflat, and marsh habitat should you aim for in the whole estuary or the whole region? Each of these habitat types has important services. So oysters, if you want tribal harvest, then only oysters can do that. But if fish nursery habitat is important to you, maybe eelgrass is important to you. If recreational use by bird watchers is important, the shorebird migration function of mudflats is important. If carbon sequestration is important to you, marshes are, of course they all are, but I think it's worth really thinking about which habitat type has seen the most losses in this estuary or region, which is likely to be most sustainable in the future, and what services are most critical for stakeholders in your area. And then set conservation goals for all habitats together. Think about the whole mosaic, not just one species at a time. So at this point, I will now hand it back to April for the final section.
Great, thanks, Kirstine. I'm going to just circle back on the synthesis that we did last year and show you some more lesson learned and from that synthesis, and then talk about next steps. And I'm going to try to go quickly so that we have time for questions. Okay. One of the first things we asked people were about their goals and objectives. And here you can see a number of different types of objectives on the left-hand side, and then the projects that responded that those were objectives that they set and their success in reporting them. It's not surprising that there were many numeric oyster objectives, although to me it was surprising that only 62%. I would have expected that the number of restoration projects that reported that as an objective would have been 100%. But what did surprise me is that we had what we're calling here in this graph people objectives popped up as one of the most, the highest number of objectives listed. These people objectives are things like community engagement, testing methods, and learning. And the lesson that I got from this is that for our restoration community, that these were just as important, these people objectives were just as important as a focal species. Maybe I shouldn't have been too surprised by this result, since I've worked with a lot of community groups and I know the multiple benefits. First of all, community engagement can mean a volunteer workforce. Here you can see volunteers at Elkhorn Slough actually putting together the stakes that we used in the project Kirstine was talking about. Of course, it has educational value in engaging the public and educating them about the work that you're doing. It wasn't the case in our example, but a lot of times getting together a community project can be the source of a pilot study or a way to test new methods on a small scale before you scale that up to a larger scale. And maybe most importantly, engaging the community has been shown to really garner public support for management and policies around the species and habitats that you're trying to conserve and restore. I'm going to show you two of these graphs. I'm just going to take a minute to orient you to them. The next lesson learned I want to share with you is about the oysters themselves. And here you're looking at the number of oysters on the restoration substrate after 1 year post-restoration. On the left-hand side, you can see project number and location, and down the bottom, there's number of adult oysters on the substrate. You don't have to worry too much about this order of magnitude measure. What I really want to draw your attention to, well, there's color coding. So Washington is purple, British Columbia is blue, Oregon is orange, and California is yellow. And the take home here is that after 1 year after restoration substrates were put out, there are a ton of oysters on them at most sites. This is what success looks like to me. For some of the individual sites, it doesn't look like there was any change, but for most, you're seeing oysters growing on those substrates, which is exactly what you're going for. And in some cases, a couple of projects in California and Washington, 5 orders of magnitude more oysters on a substrate certainly looks like a great success story. However, another way that you can measure oysters on the restoration substrate, you're now looking at the change in number of adult oysters on the substrate between year 1 and year 5 after restoration. This time the 0 line is in the middle, and what you need to know is that anything that falls on the right side represents an increase in oysters, and anything on the left side represents a decrease. And so here you can see we have more of a mixed bag of results. Between 1 and 5 years, at some sites, there was an increase in oysters on the restoration substrate, so that effect continued over time. And in some places, there was a decrease. Now, for some of these sites, the one in San Francisco, I happen to know, had a huge freshwater intrusion, and we're going to talk in just a minute about challenges to restoration. But the point here is that when you monitor over time, the story might be a little different. And so some of the lessons learned that we took from the monitoring data we collected, first of all projects track some measure of oysters, number, size, recruitment on the restoration substrates or in the immediate area of restoration. But if your question is how restoration is affecting that population in your estuary, a larger scale of monitoring is needed. Then that slide I just showed you was between 1 and 5 years post-restoration, but the average length of monitoring we found to be 4.5 years. And so in order to answer questions about how restoration is doing over time, how the oysters are actually flourishing or not over time, longer term monitoring is needed. Then it might not be too surprising if you think about the monetary results that Kirstine showed earlier. Monitoring effort at different restoration sites varies greatly. California, for example, monitored the widest array of parameters, and they tended to focus on ecosystem services, for example. And that's not to say that's the best approach. It's just that what we noticed is that the monitoring effort was really uneven by state and region. In terms of top challenges to oyster restoration, here you see the percent of projects reported on the left and the type of challenge on the right, on the bottom. And red represents a major impact, orange is a minor impact, and gray means it was not at all a challenge for that site. What you can see is that sediment burial, lack of recruitment, and predation were our top 3. And as Kirstine pointed out earlier, sediment burial is something that can be addressed, for example, through ecosystem level management. So one major take home that we took from the synthesis about challenges is that ecosystem level management could actually address some of the most common major impacts to restoration success. Finally, we really noticed in putting together our story map and compiling the database how the difference in regionally and how these restoration projects were spread out. And so There are 15 in Washington, 15 in California, none in Mexico, 1 in British Columbia, and an 8 in Oregon. So this really, again, is a sort of an artifact of locally driven projects, and not necessarily what you might design if you're thinking about a coast-wide plan for this species. And so the take home here is that regional strategies and coast-wide planning really are needed to improve restoration and conservation of the species as a whole. Next, I'm just going to walk you through a couple of projects that are aiming to do pretty much exactly that in terms of having a regional and coast-wide approach to management with this species. One of the projects that we're involved in that NUC has partnered with the Science and Nature for People partnership with is conservation aquaculture of marine foundation species. I'm not going to take you to the website because we're sort of short on time, but you can see it here. That's our project webpage. The overarching question that we're asking with this project is, what are the social and ecological trade-offs of using aquaculture as a conservation tool for marine foundation species, and what are the responsible methods for using this kind of approach? So at this point, even outlining risks and rewards can be really valuable to managers and ecologists alike, especially for species like the Olympia oyster, where that has not been done yet. Our products from this project will include a global synthesis to evaluate aquaculture as a conservation tool for marine foundation species, and then an index of suitability and community engagement toolbox, which will both be specific to Olympia oysters and help guide the use of aquaculture to support Olympia oyster conservation throughout the West Coast. Another project that we've engaged in this year is collaborative research and assessment of management goals in Baja California, Mexico, and that is a partnership with UC Nexus. For this project, our research goals are, first of all, to determine the distribution and population status of the native oyster and the Pacific oyster, which has populations established there, and compare those with historical data. Then we'd like to increase capacity for restoration for the native oyster in Mexico. You'll remember that 0 on the slide I just showed you. And so we're hoping to increase capacity for restoration for the native oyster, and then to establish long-term monitoring of both the native and introduced oyster species. One of our last current projects that we're working on is a partnership with the Pew Charitable Trusts, who've developed a really cool and user-friendly interactive mapping tool with which they are going to be mapping Olympia oyster distributions throughout the species' entire range. Entering data on this takes only about 5 minutes a site. So if you would like to participate, if you've got data about Olympia oyster populations anywhere on the West Coast and you think you could contribute to this project, please get in touch with Kerstin as soon as possible. This project is hoping to wrap up in August. And finally, in the future, really the next level for the Native Olympia Oyster Collaborative is to leverage this collaborative network to design experiments that take advantage of this beautiful latitudinal gradient of the species to, for example, examine climate-related responses to Olympia oysters. This is something that we've been wanting to do and talking about different topics for, and we'll be looking to fund somewhere in the very near future. So we've covered a broad range of information about Olympia oysters, our coast-wide network, and the restoration projects that have been conducted thus far. And I hope we've given you an overview of the status and restoration and conservation of this species on the West Coast. With that, I'd like to thank you all for being here and NERRS Science Collaborative for hosting us, and we'll welcome any questions you have. So I think
thanks,
Megan,
guys. Yeah, Megan's going to read some questions. I'm going to put our little Q&A thing back up on the screen here. Just a reminder, you can type your questions into the questions section of the GoToWebinar console, and we will clean up and verbalize them to our speakers.
Yeah, so we have a number of questions that have rolled in over the course of the presentation and still more coming in. So please send them along and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. First to note that there's lots of appreciation for this presentation, lots of excitement about the work that you all are doing. So wanted to pass that along. So the first question that we'll pose here is, do Pacific oysters present a problem for Olympia oyster recruitment?
Neither of us work directly in a place that has both species. So our colleagues in Southern California and Puget Sound would have a better answer. I think where Crassostrea is harvested, if Olympia oysters have settled on those, then of course you're going to lose those. And there's been some studies by Alan Trimble and Jen Rusink in Willapa Bay that shows some negative interactions between the two species there. So it may be site specific.
Okay, and we had a couple of questions that came in related to living shorelines. Some interest in whether there are any projects that are using native oyster restoration as a living shoreline function to protect shorelines, and whether there's any documented success with this. There's a comment here that we often hear Olympia oysters don't serve this purpose as well as Pacific oysters because of low profile. Anything you can speak to about living shorelines and this oyster?
So Ted Grossholtz and Shayla Zabin from San Francisco Bay have done the most, and Marilyn Lata, who's on the webinar today, have done the most work on this in San Francisco Bay, really trying to monitor the ecosystem services provided by their Living Shoreline project there. And Danielle has also done some in Southern California. To be clear, in those cases, a lot of the shoreline protection benefits are due to the substrate that's added, not due to the Olympia oysters themselves. It's the stacks of Pacific oyster shells and or the concrete structures that are doing it. So in answer to that question, probably Olympia oysters have a more modest benefit. They grow lower in the intertidal than Crassostrea, and our marshes grow higher in the intertidal than on the East Coast. And so there's not as perfect a match of the oysters coming right to the bottom of the marsh edge the way you have on the East Coast. But to the extent that you work in a system where artificial substrates are welcome and high profile substrates are welcome, then you can build these sort of artificial reefs to serve that kind of a function.
Thanks. We have another one here. What data are available to measure the effects of oyster restoration for ecosystem health?
It's a question about what data we collected as a network. I mean, so we have a database, just to elaborate on the database part that I just briefly touched on. We collected data from all 39 restoration projects that we could identify having ever been conducted on the West Coast. And we definitely got a bunch of data about those oyster metrics that I mentioned, number, density, etc. And some of those projects also directly measured ecosystem services, and the ones in San Francisco are the ones I'm thinking about that come to mind first and foremost for that. And those data we are happy to make those data available to you. You can follow the link on our website to the Gmail account that will come to one of us in the network, and we're happy to provide that for you. In terms of what other people have done, I think that's a huge topic. And there aren't a terrible number of studies done on Olympia oysters in comparison to what's been done on other oyster species, where they've really nailed down exactly how those species are providing ecosystem services and in what quantity. That hasn't really been done to a great extent for this oyster.
Yeah, there's a variety of graduate student theses focusing on particular services that Olympia oysters provide, filtration rates or habitat for other species and so on. I think what's hard to do for the ecosystem health question is scale that up to the scale of something like an estuary. And in a system like Chesapeake Bay, or at least how Chesapeake Bay was, oysters are truly a dominant component of the ecosystem, and so they really are likely to contribute very measurably, even at a very large spatial scale. For an estuary like the one I work in with my 1,000 oysters, it's just not gonna scale up to that. So I guess some of my answer would be that my personal desire to take care of Olympia oysters is more akin to wanting to take care of condors or sea otters, preserving a native species for its own sake, not so much in terms of what it provides to the larger ecosystem, though that in itself is an ecosystem service of providing value to protect native biodiversity that people want to appreciate. But we've had a lot of non-native species establish in California and actually Pacific Coast estuaries in general, and a lot of those provide filter feeding services, for instance, and so it makes it a lot harder to detect the specific role that oysters are having on that background.
There are some specific findings from the group that I mentioned in San Francisco and Tamales Bay, sort of in that region, about oysters increasing benthic diversity and that being a benefit to invertebrates and small fishes. It's just that that work there haven't been a preponderance of studies that look at that and that scale that up, but there are a few good ones. Ted Groshold and Shayla Zabin are the ones to talk to about those studies.
Danielle and her students too. Yeah.
Here's another question. Can you give an example of how climate change impacts factor into restoration decisions?
So funny you should mention that. We had a 3-year neuroscience collaborative proposal headed up by Matt Ferner at San Francisco Bay NERR and with a bunch of oyster people on it that specifically was looking at the interface of oysters, oyster restoration, and climate change on this coast. And I guess maybe one of the surprises we had is that climate change right now doesn't look to be like it's the biggest threat of the coming decades in terms of explaining the extreme declines of oysters and the places where they're really struggling. It's still things like sediment burial or hypoxia that seems to be posing a greater threat. When we did experiments raising the temperature to a pretty high level, the oysters did better, not worse. Relative to other shelled species, they seem a bit more resilient to acidification than other species, maybe because the shells grow slowly, the larval shells grow slowly in the brooded mother. Certainly increased storm frequency in places that have a lot of freshwater input could pose threats. But overall, compared to something like our salt marshes, which are all doomed within decades in the face of sea level rise, we don't see that kind of vulnerability for the Olympia oyster, and reversing some of these past issues, insults that humans have paid to their populations is probably the top priority.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question. Can Olympia oysters grow on vertical surfaces such as seawalls? How about rock riprap?
Definitely. And they do this really well in places in urban areas where a lot of the estuaries that naturally Olympia oysters might have congregated on and hadn't been able to have a toehold in have been really altered. And so you see this, they can go right up the side of pilings. They are often on the sides of seawalls. Danielle Zackrow, who's one of our collaborators we keep mentioning, who works in Southern California, a lot of her sites have, you'll see if you look on our story map, pictures of her students actually going vertical to measure the density of oysters there. So they can do really well on wherever they can get some hard substrate, as long as they're not outcompeted by other things.
But to be clear, when we synthesized those 39 projects, I think every project in Washington really wanted to make clear that their restoration goal is restoring natural biogenic habitat, not just the oysters. And so having, like those photos I showed you of beaches strewn with shells is what they're aiming for. And so while, yes, they may get some oysters growing in the Port of Seattle or something, that's not going to meet the conservation goal of restoring the type of oyster habitat that used to be there previously.
Great, thanks to you both for answering these questions. We had many more than we had time to answer during the webinar, but hopefully a lot of you learned.
If you save us, we're happy to answer them by email if you want to send them to us.
Yeah, we could easily incorporate that into kind of a post-webinar product, and we'll share that after the webinar once it's ready to go. So I'll hand it back over to Nick to wrap things up.
Yeah, thanks. Just echo what Megan said. If you do still have questions, I'll leave the webinar session open for a bit. As long as you've typed it in and entered it into the chat, it'll be saved and I'll see it. So I'll be sure to pass those along if you still have questions, which it looks like we probably do, since this was a very question-heavy webinar, which is awesome. We love to see that. Just a couple quick outro things. We do have a couple webinars coming up. Both of them are sort of TBD in terms of when the exact date will be, but you should expect them to be around the same time, so roughly 3 o'clock Eastern. Virtual engagement will be the focus of next month's. So towards the end of May, we'll be doing just sort of a quick run through on, not quick run through, I should say, but a more in-depth discussion on virtual engagement strategies, techniques, etc. And in June, we'll have another project webinar from Corey Riley's team in Great Bay. So I know we're short on time, so I'll just one more quick thank you to Kirsten and April for taking the time to put together a great presentation for us and for answering all of our questions. And again, if you do have questions, please send them along. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to Kirsten and April.
Thank you, Nick.